Buddy, and welcome to One Question with Pastor Adam. And I am Pastor Adam, and I am pastor to believers and to doubters, to unfaithful Christians and faithful atheists. And Jesus wasn't afraid of questions. And so neither are we here at One Question with Pastor Adam. So we are going to go over the questions. If you have questions and you would like me to talk about them, you can send them to me either on Facebook at the Pastor Adam Facebook page, the Clackamas United Church of Christ Facebook page, or wherever wherever you can find me. Email me if you want. So Melanie is here. Good afternoon, Melanie. Let's see. I am on location today. Yup. To Luke. Good to see you, my friend, and Melanie, my friend. All I have are questions. Good. Well, I have a question for you. Last Sunday, I'm here on location because I've got a meeting at 12:30 Pacific time today with the UCC, the headquarters. We're going to be talking about security at churches and how we can do security at churches without, let's see, with an abolitionist perspective, like without calling the police. That's what we're up to. So today is Ascension Thursday. Your video and internet seem good. Awesome. Okay, Luke, we will pray that U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy can stop being a pompous. Luke. Okay, so we're going to pray for all politicians and senators. Luke, you are cracking me up, my friend. Okay, so today is Ascension Day. It's a holy day on the Christian calendar, and it commemorates the day when Jesus ascends into heaven. Melanie is saying, "Say the word, say the word." No, I'm not going to say the word. Good morning, Jeff. For those of you who aren't here live, the word rhymes with, let's see, loosh. Loosh is not a word, but this is the fun we have here live at One Question with Pastor Adam. Foosh. My son has a friend whose last name is Fouché, and they call him Foosh. So the word that Luke wants me to use rhymes with Foosh. So there we are. Cartouche. Jeff, nicely done. Oh man, we are having fun here already on One Question with Pastor Adam. So today is Ascension Sunday, or today is Ascension Day. This Sunday is Ascension Sunday, where we commemorate the day when Jesus ascends to heaven. You can read about the ascension in 3 different places, and they kind of tell the story differently. Interesting. Mark has his own ascension at the end of Mark's gospel. Luke has a version of the ascension at the end of Luke's gospel, and Luke has another ascension story at the beginning of Acts. So they all tell it a little bit differently, but the main gist of the idea is that Jesus, after he's resurrected, he appears periodically to his friends, to the disciples, to some crowds. And after 39 days, Jesus ascends to heaven. As the ancient creeds say, Jesus ascends to sit at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead, right? Trying to remember, I grew up Lutheran, and we used to say that creed every Sunday. And so there it is. So someday I would like to do an online worship service on Ascension Sunday to commemorate the Ascension. The Ascension is a holy day, but it's one of those holy days on the Christian calendar that usually gets ignored. We don't pay much attention to it. It's not like Easter or Christmas. It's one of the I don't know. We treat it as one of the lesser holidays. Although back in history, it wasn't treated as a lesser holiday. In fact, Saint Augustine said that this was like the pinnacle day. Like this was the most important day because it was Ascension Day that kind of wrapped everything up together, and that's partly with Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father. This is like Jesus in his power and in his glory, but it's a different kind of power and a different kind of glory than what we usually think of. One of my one of one of our modern theologians is Robert Farrar Capone, an Episcopal priest. I think he used to be a chef, and then he was like, "I want to do this priest thing," and then he became a priest and wrote all kinds of really fascinating, wonderful books. This one is called "The Astonished Heart: Reclaiming the Good News from the Lost and Found of Church History." Oh, there's good news in church history, and it's lost and found. It's not so much lost as it is like ignored. Like you can find this stuff in history books, but it's a fascinating book. But Father Capone, Capone, I think is how you say it, not Al Capone, but Robert Capone, said that God's if God is handed, it's not so much God's right hand, but God's left hand. Because we usually think of like God is all powerful, and the right hand of God is where Jesus sits, and Jesus is now like the all powerful God who ascends to heaven. And Capone says, really, like if you're going to use that metaphor, maybe today a better metaphor would be the left hand of God, something that's not like that has power, but not the kind of power that we typically think of the right hand. It's like the power to coerce, the power to dominate, the power to force you to believe certain things. Whereas Capone, I think where he's going in this is like actually the left hand of God. God is only left-handed because the left hand of God is a power, but it's not the power to coerce, the power to violently force people to do what you want to do. That's not God. God's left hand is the power of love. It's the power of forgiveness. It's the ascension is where Jesus is high and where Jesus ascends to heaven. But oftentimes in the Gospels, where it talks about Jesus and the day of glory, it's talking about when Jesus is high and lifted up, sitting on the throne of His glory. It's talking about the cross where Jesus is in the full glory of God, not in order to get revenge, not in order to have power over against someone else, like we typically think of the right hand as being the all powerful one. But this is the left hand of power, the power to forgive, the power to love, the power to do those things. So I'm so excited about this episode because I was doing a little bit of research on this earlier, and I came across a video on YouTube of this guy, scholar, who was a evangelical conservative Christian, and then he started um, going to seminary and graduate school, started reading the Bible and started seeing contradictions in the Bible, and so his like view of the Bible, uh his evangelical view of the Bible just started to crumble. And a lot of us have experienced this because if you read it, you will end up seeing, oh my goodness, like within the first two chapters, the creation story is telling like contradictory ways of viewing this thing. But this guy said that one of the ways that he lost his faith was by by learning about other ancient myths. I'm sure this is that you've heard about this. Like other ancient myths are so similar to the Bible and to the way that the Gospels tell the story of Jesus that certainly, like the Bible and the Gospel are like appropriating these stories. They're just rehashing these stories. And so this episode is called "Is the Bible Just Another Ancient Myth?" How do you like that? So this is good. And one of the things that he said was precisely the story of Jesus's ascension. He said that there are other myths that tell the story of an ascending God up to heaven. And the one that he talked about was the ascension of Romulus to heaven. And, like my mind just starts like the synapses just start going. I'm like, wait a minute, wait a minute. Romulus, and he's saying that Romulus and the ascension to heaven is so similar to Jesus and the ascension to heaven as it is explained in the Gospels. And I was like, this is where like comparing and contrasting ancient myths is to the Bible and the Gospels is so interesting for me and so important because a lot of people will say, "Oh, the Bible and the Gospels are just retelling these ancient stories," and there's some truth to that. I think it's probably like there are some people who go like overboard with the comparisons. uh, there are some people who, for whatever reason, I don't know if they're like, there are some people who say that they're experts, and they say, oh, 12 disciples, and this is like Mithras and doing all of these things. And you actually like start reading those ancient myths like Mithras, and you're like, wait a minute, these aren't, they're stretching in order to get these like hardcore comparisons. But in another sense, like, there are like, because we're human, uh, we have been asking similar questions about the world and how the world works for thousands of years. Today, our questions are can be somewhat different from the ancients, right? I mean, we're in a different culture, and we've got new ways of knowledge like science and things, but we're still asking, like, what is the meaning of life, and where did this all come from, and what is my role in all of this, right? These are like the fundamental questions of meaning that ancient myths and the Bible and the Gospels are trying to help us explore, give us answers to, maybe some would say. But the comparison with Romulus and the Bible and the ascension of Jesus is really, really interesting because uh, Romulus is said to have been ascended, to taken up into heaven. Jesus is said to have been taken up to heaven on the Ascension Sunday. You may know that Elijah, the prophet Elijah, doesn't die, and that he ascends to heaven. And so these stories, like, maybe it's because of our common humanity. There are ancient myth stories about floods in almost every culture. Almost every culture has ancient myth stories about creation, and sometimes they look very similar to one another, and sometimes they are similar but have differences. And I kind of want to explore that with you today. So, do you know the story, the myth of Romulus and Remus? It's fascinating. You can Google it and find it pretty easily online. But Romulus and Remus were twins, and they were twins, and their grandfather got into a fight with his brother, and their grandfather ended up being exiled by his brother. So these are all like names that mean nothing to you probably, but Amulius ends up being the king of this region, and he kicks out his brother, and his brother's name is Numitor. And Amulius not only exiles his brother Numitor, but he also kills his nephews. Because they might be ascendants to the throne and be rivals to Amulius, and try to kill him, right? So he kills off all of the sons. This is fairly typical, right? Like in the ancient world, you want to kill off all the rivals to the throne. So this is like a kind of a cliche of a story. It happened all the time. But Numitor ends up being exiled, and what Amulius does is ends up uh, sending Numitor's daughter into a temple so that she would worship the goddess there, and made her promise chastity for the rest of her life. So she was in perpetual virginity. So she couldn't have any children in order to so that Amulius would be safe from any grandchildren that Numitor might had. Are you following me? Is this confusing? It's just rivalry between brothers, right? I mean, you see this in all ancient stories, including the Bible, and we'll get to Cain and Abel, right? Where you see similarities and also differences between Romulus and Remus. So anyway, Numitor's daughter is in this temple, worshiping this goddess, having to live in perpetual virginity for the rest of her life. Well, here's a similarity, right? A god comes and seduces Numitor's daughter. Uh, that's one way to tell the story. Uh, anyway, he ends up having sex with her. It's ambiguous as to what exactly is happening here. But this god, Mars, who's the god of war, by the way, comes and has sex with this daughter, and she ends up producing Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus are sons of the god of war. And you see how this gets played out in their myth, in the stories that they tell. So their mother, whose name is Rhea Silvia, uh, the god Mars comes and impregnates her, and here we go with Romulus and Remus. So the god, or the king, Amulius, finds out that she is pregnant, and he wants to get rid of Romulus and Remus. And so he orders them to be killed by going into a river. You may hear shades of Moses in here, right? Moses is supposed to be drowned in a river, but they put him in a reed basket. Well, Romulus and Remus are also put in a reed basket. And it's they want the elements to kill Romulus and Remus, but they end up surviving, and their boat, their raft, their reed basket ends up going to the side of the river, and a she wolf gets them and raises them. A she wolf, and then shepherds come. A man comes who's a shepherd and takes the boys and basically fosters them with his wife, and so they have this foster father and foster mother, and they end up growing up to be strong, and they do archery, and they do all of these kinds of farming, and become strong. And so that is the beginning of the story of Romulus and Remus. Well, eventually they make their way back and they get some justice for their grandfather. They end up killing off uh, Amulius and making Numitor the rightful king. Man, do you see all the like revenge and violence that is happening within this myth? That is like, that is one of the things that becomes so clear in this story, is that the way to solve our problems is with violence, is with bigger and better violence than what our opponents have. In fact, as Romulus and Remus continue in this story, they find another place. They go back to where they were found on the river, and they end up wanting to create Rome at this place on the river. Well, in fact, they have a argument about where exactly they should create their new city, and not only where they should build their new city, but also who is going to be the ruler of this city. Is it going to be Romulus or Remus? They get in a fight over this, and here you see, as I mentioned before, the ancient myth, the story of brothers in conflict with each other. And so you see this in Greco-Roman myths, you see this in the Bible. And what ends up happening is that they go to their grandfather and they're like, how should we solve this problem? And their grandfather says, well, ask for a sign from the gods. That's a good way to solve it. So they go, okay, let's do that. So they each go to the different places where they want to have the city uh, established. And it ends up that they will see uh, vultures in the sky, and this is how they're going to find out which one is right, which one will have the power, right? So Remus is the first one to see the vultures, and he sees 6 vultures flying above him, and he's like, there it is, I am the ruler and the king. Well, Romulus sees the vultures later, and Romulus has 12 vultures. Well, Remus is like, I saw my 6 vultures first, that means I'm the king. And Romulus says, well, I saw 12 vultures, which clearly means that I am the king because there were more vultures there. Interpretation of the gods and the omens and scripture, right? We have been fighting about interpretation ever since. So Romulus ends up starting to build a city. Remus starts to build a city, and Romulus creates a moat around his city. And Romulus says nobody will ever be able to jump over this moat, right? And if you do, you're going to be killed. Well, Remus comes along and he wants to do some trash talking to his brother, and so Remus is like, "I'm just going to jump over that moat." And so Remus jumps over the moat, and gets in a fight with his brother Romulus. Romulus ends up killing Remus and burying Remus underneath the moat. And Remus is never to be heard from again. And what ends up happening with this story is that Romulus ends up being the hero. Romulus builds the city of Rome out of the murder of his brother. And the murder of his brother is justified in the myth. It is seen as a good thing. It is seen as an act of violence that enabled Rome to be built. And wouldn't we want to sacrifice someone in order for the great city of Rome to be built? I mean, of course, this had to happen. And there are ways that the myth tells the stories as if this was a divine act, that this was called for from the beginning, that Remus would be killed and Romulus would take his rightful place on the throne, right? And so I'm tempted to go to the Bible right away, but I'll just quickly try to finish off the story, because Romulus, at the time in Rome, the story says there were only men in Rome. And so Romulus invites other towns around the area, other cities, to send them their uh, women who aren't married so that the men of Rome could marry the women of these other cities. And the people of the other cities say, no, I don't think so. We've heard about you Romans, and you are like a wacky group of folk. And so we don't want to send our women to you. Do you notice how like women are like pawns in this ancient story? That's a lot of the patriarchal cultures tragically treat women this way. And so uh, they don't send their women over to the Romans in order to procreate. So what Romulus ends up doing is throwing a party, and basically a sporting event, and invites all the people from the towns to come. And you know where Romulus is going with this, right? Romulus ends up killing the men, many of the men. Some of them escape, right, and taking the women for themselves. Whack, wacky story. I know, this is just like wild stuff. So the men escape. The men of the town are like, okay, we need to get revenge and get our women back. And so end up going to war with Rome. And the women don't like that their husbands and their parents are at war. And so the women put themselves in the middle of this and say, please don't fight anymore. And Romulus says, okay, I'll stop fighting if these other people say that they are part of my empire or part of my city, part of Rome, right? So the men acquiesce and they say, okay, we'll be part of who you are. And so this is how Rome starts expanding its empire. Well, so cut to the end and the ascension. And Romulus is talking with a bunch of his senators. There ends up being this storm, and everything goes like dark, right? And there's this cloud that comes and wraps Romulus and takes him up into heaven. And that is the ascension of Romulus. Romulus, while in heaven, becomes a god, Quirinus, Quirinius, no, Quirinus, and Quirinus is often associated with the god of Mars, who is the god of war, who impregnated Romulus's mom. So they get like almost enmeshed together. So Romulus, the god of war, and gets taken up into heaven. So here's my question for you: like, you're hearing me tell this story, and you're like, "Oh, yep, that's Jesus. That gospel's right there." Oh my goodness. Now, where are some similarities, right? I talked with you, I mentioned like uh Romulus and Remus are sent into this river because their lives are being threatened against them, and they end up surviving. Like, this is very similar to Moses. Now, which one of these stories ends up being told first, right? I don't think we really know. The oral traditions of the Hebrews can go back really, really far. And it's impossible to tell precisely when the story of Moses was starting to be told. So a lot of people say, "Oh, you're just appropriating the Roman myths." Maybe, Maybe it's the Roman myths are appropriating the Hebrew story of Moses. Maybe these are just like human experiences where a powerful ruler tries to kill off children by throwing them into a river. Why would they want to do this? Uh, um, to get rid of somebody who might be a threat to them, right? I mean, that's this isn't like tragically, this isn't so outlandish of a way of trying to kill people. It's also like when you expose them to children to the elements, well, nobody has really killed them. It's the elements who have killed them, right? So this is a way of for people to kill someone without taking responsibility for killing someone, and this is an ancient and tragically modern way of killing people off. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that these stories that are told in myths and these stories that are told in the Bible can feel very similar, in part because we're all human and we are all asking similar questions and dealing with similar issues, especially when it comes to power, politics, and religion. And sometimes those answers end up looking very similar, partly because there's a universal aspect to the human experience as well. Um, so that's one of them. Oh, the story of Romulus killing his brother Abel. No, sorry, I'm getting the stories mixed up. Romulus and Abel? No, it's Cain and Abel. Romulus and Remus. So Romulus ends up killing his brother Remus for jumping over the moat and showing off to his brother, doing a little trash talking. So Romulus kills Remus. And then Remus is never heard from again. He's buried, dead, gone. And it's all justified because after this, the city of Rome gets built. In fact, this is seen as uh, um, ordained by the gods, right? Well, the Bible tells a very similar story with Cain and Abel, right? Cain ends up killing his brother Abel because he's jealous of his brother's sacrifices. And out of that murder, Cain creates the first city in the Bible, right? A lot of similarities here, but notice the differences, right? Remus is never heard from again, but what happens to Abel? His blood cries out from the ground. And God hears the cry of Abel and goes to Cain and says, "Where is your brother?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the answer to that is yes. So in the Romulus and Remus myth, the gods justify the murder of Remus. In the biblical story, God does not justify the murder of Abel. In fact, God says, "Where's your brother? Why did you do this?" Remember, God says to Cain, "Sin is lurking at your door and you must master it." And what is that sin? Killing his brother. The Bible tells this first story about these two brothers in a radically different way. Yes, there are similarities, but the similarities highlight the differences. And that is justification, the differences in their interpretation of violent events. The Cain and Abel story, the murder of uh, where Cain murders Abel, is not justified by God. In Romulus and Remus, the murder is justified by God. In fact, the gods ordain it, right? It's almost as if violence is written into um, the human story, right? Even at the beginning, where here's another comparison, right? When I told you that Rhea Sylvia, the mother of Romulus and Remus, was a virgin and a god came and impregnated her, you're probably thinking of Mary and God coming and Mary saying, "Let it be," right? And so Mary is told to be a virgin. Jesus is a son of God, right? Romulus and Remus are sons of God. And there's the comparison, right? And so some people will just stop there and be like, "Oh, yep, it's just ancient myths being told in the Bible. But notice the difference. Jesus, the Son of God, has none of this desire for revenge, has none of this desire to kill his enemies, but preaches something radically different than what the story of Romulus and Remus tells. Love your enemies, right? Jesus, the Son of God, is the reflection of God. Romulus and Remus, the son of Mars, are a reflection of Mars. In fact, in the end, as I told you, Romulus is becomes the god Quirinus and basically gets associated with Mars. These are like one and the same. And so in the ancient world, to be a son of God is to be the reflection of that God, to enact that God in the world. This is what the incarnation of Jesus is getting at. This is where the Gospel of John ends up saying things like, where Jesus says, "The Father and I are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." When who is it? I forget who it is, but one of the disciples asks Jesus. It was Thomas. Thomas asks Jesus, pretty sure, don't quote me on that, somebody can Google and check me on this one. Thomas asks Jesus, show me the Father. Basically, what is God really like? What is this Father that you have been preaching? What is this Father really, really like at its core? And Jesus says, hey, you've been with me these last 3 years and you still don't know who the Father is. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This is what Son of God language is getting at. What does God really look like in the world? Our children, for better or worse, are somewhat of a reflection of parents. Now that can be abused, right? But my sons look a lot like me, and that's kind of how this works. Well, that's how this Son of God language works too. If you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus, the one who turns the other cheek, the one who seeks to love his enemies. Remember in Luke chapter 6, I think it is, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Plain, God is kind to the unjust and the wicked. God is so kind, universally kind, uh, eternally kind to everyone, including those that we call our enemies. Right now, that's not to say that that God is not just, right? But God's love is what guides God's justice. So in the gospel accounts, God's love and justice are intertwined. It's not that love and justice are like opposites within Jesus or opposites within God, and God is in this tension between love and justice. I mean, if God is in, I'm in tension. I have tension within myself with a lot of things, and I go to see a therapist. If God has tension within God's self, maybe God should see a therapist, right? Where's the divine therapist for God? No, it's not that God is in this tension with the divine, with God's attributes. It's that the divine attributes are one and the same. What does this mean for justice? God's justice is restorative. God's justice is not about revenge, not about punishment, but is about restoration, right? So yeah, that's those are like radical differences that we see within the gospel account and ancient myth accounts. Now, I don't want you hearing that I hate myths and that I'm against all myths and the gospels are just, or the Bible is infinitely better than myths. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think there are a lot of great things in ancient myths that we can learn about the world. In fact, in the Romulus and Remus story, it gives us a truthful reflection of how humans often act. And that is, we tend to think, we have been trained to think by human culture from almost the very beginning that the way to solve our problems, yeah, you may try to talk things out or whatever, but when push comes to shove, the way to solve our problems is by having more violence than better, bigger, better, more violence than the other person. This is what Walter Wink calls the myth of redemptive violence. And this is truthful to how humans tend to act. It's how the United States acts. It's why the United States outspends like the next 8 countries combined in our military budget, because we think along with ancient Rome, and you see this in developed in the story of Romulus and Remus. We think like ancient Rome, that the way to peace is through violence. The way ancient Rome was known as the Pax Romana, right? The peace of Rome. And how did Rome keep the peace? uh, the way of Romulus, by killing our enemies. That's it. Now, contrast that with the Pax Christi, the peace of Christ. This is where Jesus says, like in the Gospel of John, uh, I give you peace, peace I leave with you, but I do not give as the world gives peace, right? How does the world give peace? By killing our enemies. How does Jesus give peace? By through non-violent direct action, like he does at the temple, uh, and through radical kindness, through radical love, living into that at its core inside of ourselves is what leads to peace. And it ain't always easy, especially in a world that is so dominated by the myth of redemptive violence. So, yeah, Jesus ascends, and Romulus ascends. Uh, Romulus ascends to be like the god of Mars, the god of war, and you pray to Romulus. Quirinus now is his name, for success in war. Jesus ascends and is at the right hand of God and doesn't change, right? This is where Hebrews, I think it's chapter 14, where it says that Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, right? It's not as if Christ on earth is like, oh, yeah, love your enemies, forgive. God is kind to everyone, including the wicked and the ungrateful. But then all of a sudden, yeah, Christ descends to the right hand of God, and Christ is now different and going to come back and become like the god of Mars, right? Uh, all gods of Mars are, I'm trying to say this in the most nonviolent way possible, washed away uh, once you understand the radical difference between uh, Jesus as the Son of God and Mars, Romulus as the Son of God. So I hope that that helps tease something out here. As I mentioned at the intro, Augustine said that the Ascension is the most important day on the Christian calendar, more important than Christmas, more important than Easter, because it solidifies Jesus at the right hand of God in his power, but that power is non-violent love that, yeah, seeks a more just world in the sense of restoring that world back to the goodness of Genesis chapter 1 and the creation story, where the world is good. We talked about that a little bit last week, but that's another story that you can compare and contrast with other ancient myths that also tell a truth. Like I'll just quickly do the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, where the gods are at war, and the mother god is at war with the children god, and because the children god are being a little bit too noisy, and the mother god can't sleep, and the mother god and the generals come and go to war with the children god, and Marduk ends up taking the children god as the general and killing off the mother god and creating the world out of the mother god's, Tiamat's body. Tiamat is evil, her body is evil, the world is evil, and out of this great war comes the creation of the world. So what does that mean for the world? The world is violent. The world is fundamentally an evil, violent place. And your job as a human is to escape the evil, violent world, to go into a spiritual space, into heaven or something like that, right? Well, the Bible tells a radically different story than that Babylonian creation myth, where it just says God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's boring. Where's the war? Where's the violence? This is the Bible trying to tell the story differently in order to say all the violence in the world exists. Like right after the creation story, almost immediately you get the flood. I mean, it only takes six chapters for everything to go to another word that I shouldn't say on the podcast. Poop. The world to go to poop because humans are violent. Because the story says humans are wicked, and what is our wickedness? Our violence. But this is not how the world is supposed to be. This is not how humans are supposed to be, because the creation story says it is good. Creation is good. Humans are fundamentally good, and we have the option, the freedom to live into that goodness or not. So, whew, how about that? How about that? Okay, so I think we've got some questions and comments here, and okay, here we go. Here we go. Now, all of this to say is there are a lot, I'm sure you know, of um, violent elements in the Bible. There is also a contrast of those violent elements. This is where one of the people that I follow, I've mentioned him a couple of times, Rene Girard, has helped me out a lot in seeing that the Bible is a text in travail, a text that is struggling to birth something new into the world. And that is a new understanding of who God is. That for me, um, maybe for Christians in general, I don't know, but for me, the way that I've understood this is that fundamental change uh, happens in the person Jesus. So in the Hebrew scriptures, Hosea will say that God desires mercy, steadfast love, and not sacrifice. Right, and so here you get along with other prophets and laws like love your neighbor as you love yourself, which Jesus says is that's it. That's the one. And so you get this kind of teasing out in the Bible of what is God really like? Arguments in the Bible of what is God really like? And for me, the language of the Son of God is what helps me understand what God is really like. Uh, Notice in the Gospels, Jesus will often say, as I said before, if you want to know who the Father is, look to Jesus. Well, Jesus doesn't say, if you want to know who the Father is, look to uh, Paul or Peter or Moses or Joshua, right? He's very specific. He doesn't say, look to the Bible. He says, look to me as the image of the Father, of what God is doing in the world. So that is one of the ways that I am able to tease out this conversation too. So I love ancient myths. I didn't bring it with me, but I've got a book on ancient myths that I love to read. I think that they tell a very important truth about being human, and it's often in contrast with the Bible. So the truth that we often get caught up in these violent reciprocity with one another. And oftentimes in myths, that violent reciprocity gets reinforced, whereas in many places in the Bible, ultimately in Jesus, that violent reciprocity gets challenged with something different. As Gandhi would say, like stopping the cycle of violence and replacing it with something different. Nonviolent action, nonviolent love. So okay, so let's see. I haven't seen the comments in a while, but okay, so we're still Luke, we are still praying for Bill Cassidy, the US Senator, to stop being a pompous you know what. So that's good. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of cartouche rhyming with the word that I'm not going to say. Luke says, I wonder if the ascension is a metaphor. Yeah, I think looking at the ascension, looking at the resurrection as a metaphor is, I think, a very valid way of looking at it. You know, there are some who say I preached on the second Sunday after Easter that there are some people who just want to force the Christian doctrines upon you and say, you must believe this, and this. Whereas I am like, if you believe this, and this, awesome. If you can't believe this, and this, there are other truths that are just as valuable, maybe even more valuable than believing in the literalness of the ascension or the literalness of the bodily resurrection. I do believe in the literalness of the bodily resurrection and of the ascension. Uh, I I like to think of myself as a mystic, although I'm don't have any evidence for that being the case. But I'm not going to try to force anybody to believe in those things. For some of us, we just can't get there, and that's fine. But I love where Luke is going with this, as seeing the ascension as a metaphor. And what is it a metaphor for? What is the metaphor trying to get us to understand? Um, if you can't get there literally, that's good. That's fine. What is the metaphor trying to help us understand? A different way for how the world works, a different way from the stories that we often tell ourselves. You know, it's not just the ancients who are telling these myths of redemptive violence uh, um, that we hear so often. It's also our modern world. I mentioned that the United States falls under this myth of redemptive violence. That the way to really solve our problems is through violence and war, not just in war, but in our policing, in other aspects of our culture. Ultimately, it's the, oh my goodness, the NRA's statement, what, that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. I mean, that's the mentality that I grew up with in the United States. That's kind of our cultural ethos that the NRA has tapped into, and it's a truth that we believe in, but it's also a lie, right? How can something be a truth and a lie? It's a truth that typically we believe that that is how the world is. That the way to defeat bad violence is with good or better, or just more violence than what our enemy has. Um, and it's a lie, because that's not the way to peace. That's not the way to make the world a better place. Uh, Jesus, I think, when he goes out, you don't get these kinds of miracles. A lot of these kinds of miracles in the ancient world. You do get them. I shouldn't say that, but the way that Jesus deals with these problems is by feeding the hungry, right? Is by uh, turning water into wine at the wedding at Cana. And what's so important about that, besides Jesus keeping the party going? If you ran out of wine at your wedding party, you would be shamed for the rest of your life. So Jesus stops the cycle of shame, enters into a world showing us a radically different way than the way of shame and the way of violence. It's the way of stopping that cycle, from being uh, from continuing. Starts with each of us, and changing a culture. This is what the kingdom, the realm of God, is all about. Um, I like the phrase kingdom because it points to us being as a family. Although many of us, family imagery is not helpful because not all of us have good families. But I also like kingdom because Jesus is, as long as we understand that Jesus is not coming to give us an authoritarian kingdom, but transforming all of our kingdoms into the way of love, nonviolent love. How did I get on? Oh, that was the metaphor. And you can believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus and not live into what Jesus taught, right? You can have all of the intellectual beliefs, do all of the theological studies, and still miss the point. And so, if that is where folks are at, I would rather they not believe in the literal resurrection and believe in it, as Luke is saying, as a metaphor, because you can get stuck in the literal event of what may or may not have happened, uh, and demand that people believe this, and completely miss the point that it is not about you literally believing that this happened, but how we live our lives, right? And at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus appears to his disciples. This is one of my favorite stories. Jesus appears to his disciples and they're up on this mountain, and Jesus is talking with them, and the story says some of the disciples doubted. Some of the disciples doubted the resurrection. You've probably heard me tell this story before. It's one of my favorites, right? Because there's a place for doubt. And Jesus doesn't come to them and say, "How dare you not believe in the literal resurrection?" Right? He doesn't upbraid them for that. He ends up saying, I got a mission for you. You have doubts. Yeah, that's okay. But I still have a mission for you. Go spread the gospel. Go tell people about this radically loving, nonviolent way of living. And tragically, throughout much of Christian history, we've failed to live into that. Okay. Melanie says, I feel like the whole Bible is a metaphor. I think seeing it that way can be very, very helpful. There are there are like literal events that happen in the Bible, although the biblical authors are not interested in history in the way that the modern world is interested in history. So there are historical events like with some of the kings and things like that, that happen. But what the biblical author is trying to get at is not literal history, but the meaning behind the historical events. And so that's part of the reason why many of these stories are told differently, because the authors of the Bible find different meanings in these stories. Last week we talked about the devil and Satan, and in First Corinthians and in second no First Corinthians, that's New Testament. I'm sorry. So I was going to say Second Chronicles, and I think it's First Kings or First Samuel. I can't remember exactly what it is, but in the First Samuel, Second Samuel story, whatever. One of the things is like David does a census, and in one of the stories, it's God who calls David to do the census because God's angry at Israel, and in the other one, it's told as Satan as doing the one, having David do the census. Well, which one is it? This is a contradiction, and you can't square that. You can't put that square peg in that round hole. That's what I'm trying to say. So what is that about? People are experiencing these stories in different ways, the meaning behind the stories in different ways. And you know what's great about the Bible? It includes all of those different understandings. It is inclusive of these different ways in which people have understood God and how the world works. So seeing it as a metaphor, Melanie, I think is a really helpful way to understand, especially, and it works within what the biblical authors are doing, which is not literal history as we Western moderns try to tell literal history, but it's infused. What's the meaning behind events? What's the meaning behind stories? That's what it's getting at. So Luke says most stories throughout time have been recycled in creative ways. Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of folks who will accuse the Bible of appropriating these stories from other lands or other peoples. And I think, Luke, you're exactly right. Like these stories are constantly being what's the word that you recycled, right? And it's not just the Hebrews that do this, it's other cultures who do this too. It's part of being human. And some of the stories are just very similar because humans tend to ask the same questions. In South America, there were flood stories. In Mesopotamia, there were flood stories. It rains a lot on Earth in some places. So it's not a stretch for us to think, well, maybe people have been worried about a flood, and what might happen if there was a flood? Why would there be a flood? All of these kinds of questions. I don't think no. Uh, how should I say this? There was not a literal flood that happened. These are stories that people are telling that are trying to get at a bigger truth. It's the metaphor the helpful metaphor that Melanie is getting at. So again, if you are committed to understanding the flood as a literal event, fine. But what are you getting out of the story? Hopefully you're getting the rainbow message that God actually changes God's mind in the story. God's like, oh, whoops, let's not do that again, and promises that no matter how bad things get, God is not going to flood the earth again, right? That brings up all kinds of questions of like, can God change God's mind? The Bible is perfectly, throughout the Bible, God changes God's mind. Uh, Traditional classic theology is very uncomfortable with God changing God's mind because it's a lot influenced by Greek philosophy and not the Bible. Because throughout the Old Testament, God is like changing God's mind a lot. People are arguing with God and getting God to see their point of view. And that is often the point of view that God's character is mercy, steadfast love, the Hebrew word hesed. And oftentimes, when people are arguing with God in the Bible, it's for God to live out God's hesed, God's steadfast love and mercy. It's often people reminding God who God is. You are the God of love and mercy. Now, God doesn't always live into that in the Bible. And you can find that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. A lot of times we want to think, oh, it's just the Old Testament that's got the violent God, but like the Book of Revelation, man, that can be interpreted in all kinds of dangerous ways. The Book of Revelation was the last book in the Bible, incidentally, to one of the last books to get admitted into something like a canon. Um, and so and I just got a text, sorry, something like a canon of scripture to be agreed upon as an authoritative book. And that's because the ancient theologians were like, wow, this book could be used in very dangerous ways. And hello, here we are. This book is being used in very dangerous ways. Luke says, to some cultures, the Christian narrative is mythological in the same way ancient Greek myths are as such to us. Yeah, and um, it's the tragedy of Christian history, where Christians have used our stories, our mythology, even the words of Jesus, in order to enact violence. In order to, this is the trying to think of the right word. This is the corruption of the Christian message, where we have twisted Christ and the message of Christ so much that we are able to go to war over it. It reminds me of, there are so many examples of this, but it reminds me of like the violence that was enacted over the meaning, what actually happened at communion or the Lord's Supper. Like, what are we even going to name this thing? Right? But is it transubstantiation? Is it consubstantiation? Is it what is this? And the thing that is supposed to bring us together in nonviolent love, for to remind us that even when we betray God, God comes back with nonviolent love, is a thing that we're going to fight over and kill one another for. It's just like, man. Uh, Jeff says Enoch too. I'm not. Not. I. We should do an episode on Enoch, Jeff. Um, I'm not sure what you're getting to, but I'm sure that that's the case. Melanie says, I know the myth of Romulus and Remus only because Harry Potter, of course. Yes, I was looking up Remus and came up with Harry Potter. All kinds of Harry Potter stuff, not Remus stuff. Okay, I got to get going here pretty soon. I've got a meeting here in about a half an hour that I got to get ready for. But Jeff says, wasn't there a connection to Aeneas of Troy too? I don't know. I'd have to look into that more. It's a great question. Luke says also why lawsuits over copyright for music happens. I'm usually skeptical of plagiarism claims for music. Okay. Yep. Luke says a lot of the story similarities are due to creative elements being common building blocks in our collective ancient psyche. Oh, Luke, it's exactly what I was trying to say. But you said it. You said it perfectly there. Yeah. Joshua says there's a lot to unpack here. Yep. Hopefully we've done some unpacking, and I don't know. Let me know how I did, Joshua. There's a lot of unpacking, and the myths can be a little confusing. So hopefully, I was able to get something of the Romulus and Remus myth out there. But you can Google it and find it super easily. So. Life is sometimes full of conflict and turmoil. Yeah, there's an ancient saying, Luke, that says that life is conflict, life is turmoil, and that's the only way to get things done. And certainly conflict is can be a generator for new things. But I think we're trained typically in our cultures to solve conflict not through nonviolent resolution, but through who's right, who's wrong, winning, who wins, right? And there are better ways to solve conflicts and to move forward, right? So yeah, more vultures is a funny part of the story, Luke. That's good. Uh, yeah, Jung's archetypes, Jeff. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Melanie says, my brother would have buried me under a moat if he could when we were kids. Yeah, I have two older brothers, and one of them definitely would have buried me under a moat. Uh, oh, good. Not now that we're adults. We're friends now, actually. Yeah, isn't that funny how that happens? Yeah, if you can get through childhood, you there's a chance that you might become friends with your siblings. That's good. Um, that's funny. Luke says, my sister and I are different as Tiger and Eeyore. Oh, Tigger. Sorry. Yeah, Eeyore is always my favorite. He's just so chill. Just so chill. Uh, um, yeah. So I love Eeyore. Um, let's see. Melanie, is that a good or a bad thing or neither? I'm not sure what. Um, Anyway, not sure what you're referring to there. So Jeff says, so if people are concerned about their kids being exposed to immoral literature in schools, they should insist on studying the classics. Oh, Jeff, that's funny. Okay. That's good stuff. All right. Jenny says, I'm here as an atheist, as you know, and I hope I don't offend. Oh, Jenny, I love you. No, not at all, with this idea, but I've taken to thinking of Jesus as a revolutionary, and much of the Bible was possibly constructed in the power language of the day to use myths and oral stories as messages of love, justice, and acceptance. Jenny, come on. Let's go. Love it. Yes, that's it. Those messages aren't drastically different than the messages of my fellow gay anarchists, but using a more powerful message delivery system than Twitter. Jenny, come on with it. I love it. Yes, like some of the stories, you could see some of the stories in the Bible as hijacking ancient stories and telling something radically different. This is what I'm trying to get at with the creation story in Genesis when you compare it with the Babylonian creation story, right? It's a radically different story, and it is telling it telling the story in a revolutionary way, a way that is so different from other ancient stories. And those other ancient stories are true. Like as Luke said, so much of the world is strife. So much of the world is it seems to be run on violence and death. But the Genesis creation story tells it in a, what did you say, Jenny? Revolutionary way, revolutionary nonviolence. That's what this story is getting at. And a lot of the stories in the Bible are doing very similar things, trying to subvert the ways that humans have become and the way that we still are. And sometimes that subversion is very clear, and other times it's a reflection of the way that humans are. Teasing that out is part of what it means to be a good student of the Bible. With the help of my friend Renee Girard. So Joshua says, what cultures, myths, folklores inspired the Bible, specifically Judaism, that led to Christ the Messiah? I'd have to think about that a lot more. Um, the stories in the Bible are often influenced by the Babylonian stories, not just the creation story, but the flood story. And Yeah, I'd have to look into that some more, Joshua. That's good. Good question. Yeah, Melanie, God changes his mind in the flood story. God repents. Yeah, God repents of the violence that God does. Now, that's going to make a lot of people upset because how can God repent? Right. Well, the flood story says God changed God's mind. That's what repentance comes from, the a word that means like to change your mind. That's what repentance means. And God does it frequently. So parables have metaphors that are in common. That's good. Yeah, Joshua, I like that. Um, all right. Okay. I think Joshua says parables, aka metaphors, are common. It's a good way to share the message from God to humans. Yeah, parables are another one that we could do a whole lot of talking about, and understanding the parables, and how Jenny was getting at, like, a lot of these stories subvert other stories that are being told. And the parables are so important because it's often like the king who is in charge in a parable, who ends up being typically the bad guy. Although we think of the king as the God character in the stories, but Jesus doesn't say that. In fact, the kings often are not the God character. Who is the God character? If you look at it through the eyes of Jesus and what happens to Jesus, parables often have at the end somebody who gets killed, right? If Jesus is the God character, who's the God character in these stories? The one who gets killed, right? That's how radically subversive and transformative Jesus is trying to help us understand who is God in the world. Not the one who kills, not the one who has power over and against others, but radically different. In fact, the God who gets killed and comes back to offer forgiveness. That is a radically different story than almost every other ancient myth story of resurrection, uh, where the gods resurrect in order to haunt, in order to get revenge. Jesus resurrects in order to offer forgiveness and peace to those who abandoned and betrayed him. Okay, so I got to get going here. Uh, okay, Joshua says God does repent. This is my theory. Todd says Scripture is great as a relational guide rooted in love until it's weaponized to justify hate. Yes, Todd, that is a perfect way to put it. When we use Scripture in order to justify hate, we turn it back into a typical ancient myth like Romulus and Remus myth, something that Jesus is trying to get us not to do over and over again. So awesome. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for your comments. Hope this was helpful. I think we will do this all again next Thursday, live at 11 o'clock Pacific, here on the Clackamas United Church of Christ Facebook page and the Pastor Adam Facebook page. One Question is a product of the Raven Foundation. Forgot to mention in the intro that I am working on a book, a new ebook for the Raven Foundation. If you subscribe to the Raven Foundation, you will get it for free. And it is a book exploring religions, like we've done a little bit today, and nonviolence and violence, and the relationship between religions, specifically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is what I'm focusing on in the book so far. So if you want that book, sign up for the Raven Foundation website. And what else do I need to tell you? Thank you. If you are listening to this on the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can keep up with One Question with Pastor Adam wherever you do that. And if you listen on a podcast platform where you can rate and review, I would love for you to do that, of course, with a 5-star review and a very nice comment. So thank you for doing that. Much love to you too, Todd. Thank you so much. Friends, that is it for today's episode. Hope you have a great rest of your Ascension Day, and may you know that you are loved, and pass that on to others. Until next week, friends, God be with you.